You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, welcome back. I apologize. Right before the break, I had my schedule confused. We'll get to that other interview later. Right now, I'm joined by Brian Lyman, who's the editor of the Alabama Reflector. And, you know, we just went through a heck of a conversation about Tennessee. Gird thy loins, as you say. This one's not going to be any better.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm almost not sure where to start in Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote about the Supreme Court's war on Southern democracy. I love that piece. But I want to start here because I read today, right before I went on the air, that the Speaker of the Alabama House, a guy named Nathaniel Ledbetter, told reporters that he hoped the Supreme Court would overturn the 14th Amendment. Now, I got a lot of thoughts about that. And Supreme Courts don't overturn the Constitution. That's not their job. And I wonder whether when you get elected in Alabama, don't you raise your hand and swear to support the Constitution? I mean, what the hell?
We were there for that, and I'm going to say that was probably a he misspoke, because after a few minutes later, one of the reporters in the room said, "Wait, are you saying you want to repeal the 14th Amendment?" And he backed down pretty quickly from that, tried to clarify that. So
he just wants to ignore it, not repeal.
Right. But I think that is, in some ways, that is the history of Alabama. They want to ignore the Reconstruction amendments, and the state has moved heaven and earth to do that for 125, even let's say 150 years. We live under a constitution that was designed specifically as a response to a populist Republican alliance in the 1890s that came very close to toppling the dominant Bourbon Democratic regime. It was a constitution passed. The convention itself was convened through fraud. The president of the convention said, "We are here to establish white supremacy within the confines of the Constitution." And
forgive me, you're talking about the Alabama Constitution.
The Alabama Constitution, correct? Yes. And then that Constitution was sent out to voters. It was not popular because unfortunately, the state, there were not enough voices to challenge Black disenfranchisement, but there was also disenfranchisement for poor whites, which everybody noticed and most people opposed. And again, Constitution was passed through fraud. The key thing to understand about Alabama, and I think any state Southern government, is, like you look at Illinois, and I know Illinois, obviously, state government there has its share of issues. One of the things, though, that's key to any government, whether it's Illinois, New York, Massachusetts, north of the Mason-Dixon line, is that there is some expectation that the government is going to represent the people there. That is not the expectation. That is not the foundation of Southern government. Southern government was founded essentially to protect the men who held men, women, and children in bondage, give them every scope possible to maintain that, give them any power to do that. So government, however imperfectly, in the North serves the people. Government in the South serves the elites. Like Alabama, when Alabama has anything, it basically comes from the federal government, whether it's voting rights or whether it's the Tennessee Valley Authority. Like Alabama never did anything like, let's say like in Illinois, there was never anything in Alabama equivalent to the Illinois and Michigan Canal. Like what government exists here exists to protect the powerful.
Well, you did build a pretty good university.
My wife works for one of those universities. So we're proud of that. Yeah.
I mean, that's not nothing. I mean, right now that's under attack too around the country.
Yes. Yeah. And even in Auburn too. Yeah. Yeah. And we've written about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So that's a really depressing start. So talk a little bit. I mean, Alabama is, I think, 26% Black.
Right, 26% Black, yeah.
Right. So where do those people get representation?
So Alabama's district lines right now are drawn not just at the congressional level, but even at the state level and at the State Board of Education level. They're essentially drawn to reflect the number of Black Alabamians within the population. So if you were to look at the Alabama House and the Alabama Senate right now, the Democratic caucus in both chambers is overwhelmingly Black. It's also roughly the proportion of Black Alabamians in those chambers is about 25, 27%, depending on how you do the math. So, and that's essentially to keep in line with the Voting Rights Act, or at least the Voting Rights Act as it was understood in prior to Louisiana. Yeah, right, right. That was, I mean, and that was typically like how it was done. There have been many obstacles put up to Black voting. I mean, obviously, Shelby County versus Holder, the 2013 Supreme Court ruling that gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, that also came out of Alabama. That came out of a suburb south of Birmingham. So any kind of power that Black Alabamians have is essentially a legacy of the Voting Rights Act and a legacy of the civil rights movement, which is why, you know, if you saw the protests that took place in and around the State House this week, there were enormous invocations of that history and that memory. There were people who were, there were people beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge who came to speak. There were people who faced Bull Connors, fire hoses, and the dogs who came to speak. Mary Moore, who's a Democratic representative from Birmingham, was one of those children who marched in 1963. That is the only guarantee that we have of democracy in this state. It comes from the federal government. And when the federal government pulls the rug out from under those protections, that's when Alabama gets in trouble. I mean, you can go back to, I mean, obviously, we know what happened with Louisiana versus Calais, but we also know, I mean, there's unfortunately a shameful history before the Warren Court of the Supreme Court doing this. Back in 1902, a postal worker named Jackson Giles challenged the Alabama Constitution, with the backing of Booker T. Washington, all the way to the Supreme Court. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote an opinion basically saying that, yes, you're right, this takes away your rights, and no, there's nothing we're going to do about it. That's the kind of thing, if Alabama does not have those federal protections, the people who run Alabama will take those protections away, because Alabama government is not meant really to be a democracy. It's meant to have the forms of a democracy, but its real purpose is to ensure that a few powerful people have the scope to act as they would like.
Brian, you phrased that as if the federal government no longer backstops civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
There is no if. The federal government is no longer in that business.
Right.
The Supreme Court doesn't believe in it and has gutted the laws, the civil rights, the great civil rights laws of this country. And the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department has been told to focus on the rights of white men.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it. So there is no if. So what do you expect to happen?
Well, there is. So the one thing that bailed us out earlier in this decade was, as you might know, Alabama had a second. They call it an opportunity district. It's not a majority minority district. I think it's like 48, 49% Black district, currently represented by Shamari Figures, who lives in Mobile. When that case went to the Supreme Court, everybody was convinced that this is going to be a dead issue. We're just going to have a 6-1 Republican Democratic map. What bailed out democracy in the state was that the state put on a terrible case, like an absolutely garbage. Like Samuel Alito actually had to intervene to try to help the attorney who was trying to argue on behalf of the state. Now we have. One of the things that we're going to be watching, obviously, for the next few days is that if you look at the Calais ruling, Alito said that this does not apply to Allen versus Milligan, which was the case that set up Alabama's second opportunity district, as it were. The Milligan plaintiffs are leaning in on that, like just pointing out this language. A lot of Democrats pointed that out repeatedly during the week. Like, this special session that we just had, It really didn't do redistricting. It set up like primary elections should the courts allow them to redistrict. Now, do I underestimate the Supreme Court's willingness to contradict itself when it can advance some kind of conservative power? Absolutely not. If I would not be shocked if they say, well, no, actually, sorry, we were just kidding. Like Milligan actually does come under this. But it also seemed like this was the same approach that Alabama had when they were trying to overturn Milligan in 2023. They had this naive hope that they could convince Brett Kavanaugh to like switch his vote and change his mind on that, which was a terrible, terrible legal strategy. And the courts all said that this is a terrible strategy. So, there's a fine, unique mixture in Alabama of malevolence and incompetence. So one of the things you might hope is that like the latter wins out over the former.
Well, certainly they'll run out of time before the next election.
They're getting there. I mean, yeah, like I think like the drop dead deadlines are like late August or something, but we already have a primary election set for May 19th. The laws that they passed this week would allow special primary elections to be scheduled, but then there's another issue there, which is Alabama voters in 2022 approved a measure that says you can't change the election laws within 6 months of an election. That deadline this year was May 3rd. The special session began on May 4th, so they seem to be in violation of the Alabama Constitution. Now, Republicans are argued throughout the week that law meant general elections, not primary elections. I think that's a weak argument, but I will see what the courts do on that.
The state Supreme Court.
Yeah, right. That would probably go to the state Supreme Court, which is a 9-0 Republican body. So I wouldn't hold my breath with those folks.
In this context, let's turn to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Mm-hmm. First, tell everybody what it is, and then what the controversy is.
So the Southern Poverty Law Center was founded in 1971. It can be best described as a civil rights nonprofit with / law firm, I guess, which is the best way to define it for most of its history. It made its name suing Ku Klux Klan organizations around the South, bankrupting them. In 1987, they successfully sued the United Klans of America, who lynched a 19-year-old Mobile student in 1981, basically drove them into bankruptcy. Since then, SPLC has stood for many progressive causes, labor. It was involved heavily in litigation against Alabama's anti-immigration bill in the 2010s. It monitors hate groups throughout the country. I will say this before we get to the case itself. I will say SPLC has had some historic issues, like particularly with treatment and promotion of minority employees in the organization. Its employees organized a few years ago, formed a union, and SPLC management hired a union-busting law firm to try to dissuade them. So I say that just to say that this is not necessarily like an unblemished lamb. That said, last month, the Department of Justice brought criminal charges against SPLC, claiming that, as a way of background, one of the ways that SPLC disrupted these Klan groups was by paying informants within the organizations, basically when SPLC did this in the late 70s and early 80s, there were serious concerns about Klan violence. Obviously, Michael Donald's lynching in Mobile in 1981 was a major one. So SPLC paid these people within these groups to essentially monitor like their interstate activities, which they would pass on to the law enforcement and whatnot. The fact that SPLC was using informants, that's been known since like 1986. The fact that they were paid informants, that's been known since 1994. DOJ's argument in this lawsuit is that by paying these informants, the SPLC was effectively enriching the white extremist groups that they were disrupting and essentially perpetrating a fraud on their donors. Now, if you did not know SPLC was an anti-Klan group, by 1987, seriously, like, you don't have a grip on reality here. Like, they were consistent about it. I mean, Morris Dees, one of the co-founders of the SPLC, I saw him speak at Fordham University, my alma mater, in the mid '90s, talking about like their
Yep.
lawsuits against
Yep.
this. So the case itself is utterly and completely absurd. The SPLC was arraigned in court this week. They pled not guilty. I mean, there's another whole issue about arraigning a nonprofit, which is but I'm not a lawyer. That's way beyond my scope of things. However, SPLC has also been demanding the grand jury transcripts that DOJ used to indict them. That they're claiming that DOJ misled the grand jury. There is really it's simply an absurd charge. There is no universe in which SPLC was ever an ally of, take your pick, the KKK, neo-Nazis, like whatever have you. I mean, that's literally absurd. And SPLC even like worked very hard to protect these informants because they knew that they were going to probably get killed if their buddies found out what they were doing. So it's just simply another absurd prosecution. I think, the one thing you can say about the Southern Poverty Law Center is that they have incredible resources to defend themselves. So they are not simply, I don't think they're just going to knuckle under and let this case go without a serious fight.
Yeah. Well, around the country, many people don't think it's about them at all. It's just to chill um, anti-racism organizations everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Which is probably true. It's just that and I hope people will. I hope people will, and I understand that a lot of groups do not have the resources that SPLC does. The one thing I would suggest folks who may be scared look at is this DOJ's track record when it comes to bringing these prosecutions, because it's not great at all. I mean, the courts, for not everywhere, but at least like at the medium and lower levels, the courts are holding firm, for the rule of law.
Yeah. Well, all right. So just we now have this. We now no longer have really a Voting Rights Act. We have institutions that have long been guardians of civil rights under attack from the federal government. That's a new reality in America. And it's one that will make zero difference in Illinois. It'll make zero difference in lots of states where we will continue to fight for the civil rights of the people who live in our states, and won't engage in this. It won't use the retreat of the federal government as an opportunity to impose coercive rule on our people. But you're suggesting that that's going to happen in Alabama and in other states of the former Confederacy.
Yeah. Like, what we need is it's going to take a lot of coalition building and kind of a revival of the local, just the local infrastructure to kind of like start bringing the pressure to restore some of these laws. I mean, the one thing I would say though is what we saw at the State House this week was very impressive. One of the key, when we just talk about politics, one of the key problems that the Alabama Democrats have had over the last several years is that their voters have not been turning out. In the 2024 election, the Democratic vote totals were about 10% lower than they were in 2020. Now, some of that is due to a lack of competitive races. Some of that is due to Alabama making it much more difficult to vote than it really should be by any baseline.
Let me ask you about that. Let me ask you about old-fashioned voter suppression.
Mm-hmm.
Is it true that in mostly Democratic counties, the polling places move and people don't know about them? They show up to vote.
Yes, sometimes. So that's happened in the past. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether it's like a genuine attempt at voter suppression and whether it's a reflection of population. A lot of one of the issues with the black counties that we see here is that many of them are aging rapidly and the population is dropping quickly. Like Perry County, which is just south of Tuscaloosa, they lost 20% of their population just between 2010 and 2020. Like I don't want to say you've got to give them the benefit of the doubt, but there are certainly other
And
factors.
is that population decline? Well, first off, about Democrats and Republicans in your
Mhm.
state. Is that line entirely race? I mean, are there like almost no white Democrats and almost no black Republicans in your state?
It's you could basically describe it as a racially polarized electorate.
Wow.
Black Alabamians tend to vote for Democrats, and white Alabamians tend to vote for Republicans. The one exceptions that we're seeing are like kind of like around the Huntsville area, where there's a lot of folks moving in from like say like Northern Virginia and places
Hmm.
like that, where the electorate looks a bit more like what you would expect nationwide. But yes,
Hmm.
and that's not just me talking. That's the federal courts saying that we find that voting is racially polarized in the state of Alabama. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. Wow,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Oh,
Yeah.
all right. So
Yeah.
so
Mhm.
the so the decline in population in the counties you're talking about
Mhm.
is because of an aging population dying, or is there also once again migration out of the state?
It's not necessarily out of the state, although I'm certain there's people going to Atlanta and like those areas as well. But what you tend to see is there's one state senator who represents a Western Alabama district, and we spoke to him a few months ago, and he said all his constituents are moving up to Tuscaloosa. What's the reason? There are jobs in Tuscaloosa.
Mhm.
Like when you look at the Black Belt, there are some parts of it that are like third world countries when it comes to poverty. Wilcox County, especially, is like notorious for that. We had sewage issues in Alabama, and we still do in the Black Belt, that allowed tropical diseases to come back. Like things that's the kind of poverty that you're looking at, and that's the kind of poverty that people are trying to flee. But like when you talk about, you mentioned the polling places, and like I said, you can have some benefit of the doubt on that. You can't have the benefit of the doubt like when I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, the legislature passed a law that criminalized certain forms of absentee ballot voting assistance. When we talk about an aging population, absentee voting is kind of critical for those folks to hear, to like have themselves heard. So even if you were to try to exclude, the racial elements of that, which I don't think you should, but even if you were to do that, you'd still see this law affecting a lot of the Black Belt counties because there's a lot of elderly people there, and there's a lot of poor folks who can't get around and can't
Mhm.
get to the ballot box. So sometimes there's a deliberate scheme going on here. Other times it's just people being ignorant of the challenges folks face, folks who aren't them.
Okay, so Kay Ivey, this is her world. You
Mhm.
gave the country Tommy Tuberville. I want to not thank you for that.
Understood.
But what do you love about the state?
I love the courage. I genuinely love the courage. The thing I think that people have to remember about Alabama is that its government does not reflect its people. The what what is inspiring about this state is how many people put themselves on the line over decades, over centuries, saying this is wrong, got to stop this. Um, you talk about people down here feel a very profound connection to civil rights activists, the people. It was interesting a few years ago after John Lewis died, there was a movement to try to rename the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And a lot of Selma residents opposed that because they said, look, my father, my mother, my grandparents bled on that bridge.
Yeah, with John Lewis. Yeah.
Yeah, with John Lewis, they sacralized it essentially. So
Yep.
we want to keep it. We want to keep it like that. And that feeling of sacrifice, of, martyrdom, the fact that Alabamians will face those overwhelming odds and say, this is wrong. And we will fight it as long as we have to, even if we don't see the victory. that really inspires me, and I think it should inspire the country. In the mid '60s, it was that attitude that revolutionized the country and the world, and I don't think it's gone yet. And I'm looking forward, and I think this week's protests especially made me think that we are going to see a lot of pushback against what the legislature did this week.
And you think I mean, this in the era you and I are in, the leadership for social action is coming from the bottom up. There
Mhm.
aren't people raising their hand and leading these because they get killed.
Mhm.
So, is there the sustainable energy to, I mean, Alabama is largely responsible for the Voting Rights Act,
Right. Hmm.
but that was 60 years ago.
Hmm.
You think that it still exists?
I mean, yeah, I think so, because that energy came out of the black churches in the
Mhm.
state, and the black churches are still a very, very important driver of a lot of this stuff. I mean, it was preaching, it was preachers that we heard at at the rallies. It's preachers who are still on the front lines of this activist movement, and it's the hymns and it's all that stuff. So there is that base there. I mean, when you look beyond that, I mean, there are certain areas of Alabama. I mean, Alabama is not going to become a purple state anytime soon. The demographics in the state simply just don't favor Democrats at the moment. But there are some areas where Democrats do have maybe some possibilities. I mentioned Huntsville earlier. Huntsville is a lot friendlier to Democrats than it used to be, and the party is really pushing up there this year. The college towns are like Lee County, home of Auburn, where I live. That's a lot less Republican than it used to be, and there are some long term opportunities
Yeah,
here. I think so.
that's interesting.
I wouldn't leave anybody with despair
Yeah.
about this, because believe me, there are Alabamians out on the front lines fighting every single day, and who would absolutely agree with anybody listening here in Chicago that yes, this is terrible and we have to change it.
That is going to be the end because we've run out of time. Brian, thanks so much. If people are interested in learning about the state, tell them how they can, find your work.
Yeah, I run a nonprofit website, part of State's Newsroom, called Alabama Reflector. We cover politics, policy, and everything else in the state. That's www.alabamareflector.com, and we are on Blue Sky and Facebook as well.
Thank you so much for your time
Mhm.
today. Really appreciate it.
Real pleasure. Thank you so much.